What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review episode 7 of House of the Dragon, an episode called Driftmark, written by Kevin Lau and directed by Miguel Sapochnik. And what do you say after an episode like that? I mean, holy moly. I mean, words don't suffice. And I'm always blown away by how this show is able to give me great scenes, some of which come from this bad boy, Fire and Blood, and some of which are of their own creation. And that's hard to do, where they find a way to make the show their own, but at the same time, faithful to the source material, because there were a few really interesting pivots from the book or twists. And what's interesting about how they go about this is that in the book, oftentimes there'll be 2 or 3 different conflicting events or conflicting reports on a particular event. And then the book will allow the reader to decide which one they want to believe, or I guess which one they choose to believe. But this show doesn't really have that luxury. It has to make hard choices. Like a perfect example would be about how in the book it was suggested that Breakbones and his father could have been killed by either the Sea Snake, by Daemon, by Viserys, or Clubfoot. The show made a choice at the end of episode 6 to go ahead and say it was Clubfoot. And as a result, as we see this episode, Clubfoot is now the possessor of Harrenhal. But this episode went a few steps further when it came to the portrayal of Alicent and when it came to the inevitable fate of Laenor Velaryon. And I'll get to all that in due time, but once again, it's just a pleasure and a privilege reviewing this show. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been kind of flip-flopping back and forth between reviewing this show and reviewing Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, I grow increasingly frustrated, whereas with this show, I just increasingly fall in love, and I don't take that lightly. Most people who have channels or podcasts or whatever devoted to reviewing film and television, more often than not, you're going to be frustrated, disappointed, or say, well, I like this, but I kind of hated this. This is a show that I just unreservedly fucking love, and I think I'm not alone. I think like 25 or 30 million people are watching this thing every week. And of course, with any show that gains popularity, you get the inevitable pushback by the perpetually self-righteous or the perpetually offended. I saw some headline over at The Independent where they were saying that how can you like a show where everybody's so evil? And it's like, did you not watch Game of Thrones? Like, did you not watch the show where in the very first episode, Jaime Lannister crippled a kid and then went on to become one of the heroes of the show? It's almost like some people out there are choosing to willfully misunderstand the setting and how good and evil do not exist in this world. There are only shades of gray. Good people do horrible things, horrible people do good things, and everything in between. And that's why we love it, and that's why it's great. And that's why it's unpredictable, and why it's exciting, and why you get to see knife fights between children and then knife fights between their mothers. I mean, this is some great, juicy, dramatic shit. We've all had experiences where we go home for Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever, and for whatever reason, the battle lines are drawn, and this is a show that just takes it a few steps further because it has swords and dragons, and it's just a delight. And clearly from the show's popularity, I'm not the only person who doesn't feel like shows are under some obligation to give us moral and ethical guidelines. In fact, I want this show always to do the opposite. So I hope that the powers that be over at HBO and the writing staff stick to their guns, stick to the book, stick to George R.R. Martin, and continue to deliver a fascinating show. So let's get into the details of this episode, which begins with the funeral of Laena Velaryon. There was no major time jump this episode, and we see that Laena's kids, Baela and Rhaena, are justifiably bereaved. And there's an interesting moment where we see Jace or Jacaerys or Jacaerys. I'm always a little confused. Is it Jacaerys or Jacaerys? Even in the audiobook for Fire and Blood, the narrator switches back and forth, but I'll just call him Jace. But we see Jace complaining to Rhaenyra that he ought to be allowed to mourn the death of a parent as well. But obviously, according to the official narrative, Laenor is his father, so he's not allowed to show sadness about the murder of Breakbones at the end of last episode. And one thing I noticed during this funeral is just how great a job director Miguel Sapochnik did of trying to tell a story visually when he can. Obviously, this show is well known at this point for great writing, but just little things like when we see Otto at the funeral and he looks down and he starts fingering the, or kind of touching the badge of office, we see, oh, he is now officially the hand of the king again. Or when we see Aegon kind of bored and yawning at the funeral, clear as somebody just needs to yank him by the hair and tell that little piece of shit to show some respect. And there are so many other little great details. Like at one point, the camera shows one dragon flying in the sky, then another, and it keeps panning down, and we see one or two just kind of lounging about. It's like, oh my God, like when all the Valarians and Targaryens are in one place at the same time, holy shit, that's a lot of fucking dragons. And there was another interesting moment during the funeral where we see the sea snake talking to Lucerys, or Luke, like a true-born grandson about being the heir to Driftmark. And it just shows how it's not just Viserys who is kind of willfully turning a blind eye to the obvious parentage of Rhaenyra's kids. And as he says later on to Rhaenys, he doesn't really care about blood. History cares about names. And I found that to be a very interesting insight into his character this episode, about how the sea snake craves legacy. He wants to make the history books, and he's just got soaring ambition for his line, for his kids, for his grandkids, far more so than Rhaenys, who's long since gotten over losing the crown to her cousin Viserys. And there was an interesting moment where Rhaenys tells her husband that she wants Driftmark and all their holdings to pass to Laena's daughters as opposed to Laenor's sons, because unlike her husband, she can see exactly what the deal is with her grandkids. But the real juicy, smoldering tension of this episode was all about the reunion between Daemon and Rhaenyra, where she tells him that she is no longer a child, and before she inevitably plants a big smooch on him, there was this great line that he says to her where he says, "If you're accusing me of some depravity, you'll need to be more specific." I was like, oh my God, like I don't even think that line comes from the book, but it is a classic Daemon line. But eventually they do surrender to their passions and go for a nice little roll on the hay on the beach. And for the first time this season, Daemon's impotence is cured. And I guess, I don't want to get too confessional or revealing in this review, but I'm a 46-year-old man. Let's just say that I could feel his pain in previous episodes as well as his relief when he was able to do the dirty deed this episode. And strangely, this show has given us very little nudity, but I haven't even really noticed it, or hasn't really bothered me the way it would under other circumstances, because the book's not particularly sexual. There's a lot of screwing, and there's a lot of breeding, and there's a lot of propagating of family lines, but it's not an erotic book in any way, shape, or form. So, I mean, I wouldn't mind if they were to insert some more obligatory nudity back into the show. But once again, when it comes to being faithful to the source material, there are not a lot of so-called kind of hot scenes in Fire and Blood. And then the rest of the episode was just a whirlwind. And most of the major events in this episode come from the book, but they're all depicted a little bit differently. Like, take Aemond, for example. When he goes out in search of Vhagar, he finds Vhagar chilling out on a beach. Whereas in the book, Aemond went down to this pit where all the dragons were being kept and was confronted by one of his cousins and ended up pushing his cousin into a giant pile of dragon shit. And then he was so worried about getting in trouble, he climbed up onto Vhagar and flew away. And so I was kind of hoping to see the giant pile of dragon shit and one of the cousins getting thrown into it, but for whatever reason, they decide to not include that in this show. But then Aemond has one of those moments where he's facing off with Vhagar, where he might have needed a change in underwear after the scene, because as he's about to ascend the little rope ladder on the side of the creature turns around. He holds his ground and he speaks the command words, and for whatever reason, Vhagar allows him to mount him and fly away. And in the book, they describe about how Vhagar, in spite of having just recently lost a rider, you never really can anticipate what a dragon might do. Dragons get very attached to their riders over time, and sometimes they can never have another rider ever again. But that there's no real rhyme or reason to kind of understanding the heart of a dragon. And for whatever reason, he decided to allow Aemond to ride him. And now the two of them are bonded, which is not so pleasing to the daughters of Laena, one of whom wanted to claim Vhagar for her own. And I thought this scene was absolutely fantastic, where Baela, Rhaena, Lucerys, and Jacaerys decide to confront their cousin. And we get this 4-on-1 slap fight, basically. And as I was watching it, I was like, every single family on the planet can relate to watching cousins and siblings and that sort of thing getting into these horrible brawls. So even though it's a fantasy context arguing about who gets to ride a dragon, the emotions of the scene feel very authentic. But then, of course, Jacaerys ends up drawing a blade. He gets decked by a rock. And then, just like in the book, Luke picks up the blade and slashes Aemond across the face. And there was even a great illustration by Doug Wheatley in the book capturing that moment. And then we got a proper knockdown, drag-out brawl between all the various family members, between the Velaryons and the Targaryens. And there were some great moments, like when Alicent smacks the shit out of Aegon for not looking after his little brother. And there's a great little detail where we see Daemon sitting in the back observing everything, and he almost had this kind of little smirk on his face, almost like he was delighted for once to see other people in trouble, not him, because decades prior, it probably would have been Daemon right there in Aemon's shoes. During the scene, Laenor is conspicuously absent. Alicent talks a little shit about how he's probably off entertaining squires. And then finally, we get to see Viserys have a proper kingly moment where he's like, enough's enough. I want to hear where these kids heard the story about the children of Rhaenyra being bastards. And he's demanding answers, and he's throwing his weight around. And finally, Aegon says what everybody knows, just look at them. And that line, once again, comes straight from the book. As does Alicent's demand that one of Rhaenyra's children has to give their eye in return. And that's some really dark, evil shit to demand of a family member. And when it comes to mothers being protective of their kids, I don't care if the mothers are good, evil, or anything in between. There's no denying that mother bear, kind of den mother, protective impulse. And so what's going to be interesting for fans moving forward is anytime they try and choose sides, whether or not they're like Rhaenyra's faction or Alicent's faction, inevitably these mothers are going to do some fucked up things that are going to test the loyalty. So, and of course, Alicent completely loses her shit. She demands that Criston Cole take Lucerys' eye then and there. And I thought he was going to make a move, but then Cole very politely and firmly says he is sworn as her protector, but he's not her enforcer. And sensing the temperature of the room changing very quickly, Viserys even goes so far as to say that anybody repeating the so-called lies about Rhaenyra's kids, that their tongue is going to be removed. And Alicent, she's having none of it, grabs a Valyrian blade, goes after Rhaenyra, slashes her up the arm. And it was interesting seeing Daemon and Cole lock up during this exchange as well. And so while Alicent will later regret her outburst, Rhaenyra is not so secretly delighted because she feels like Alicent has finally shown her true colors to everyone. But I love how Aemon, in spite of sitting there bleeding with an open wound across his face, he took it all in stride and just said, well, I may have lost an eye, but I gained a dragon, which is yet another line from the book. So Kevin Lau, I don't know who you are, but you did a brilliant job of incorporating some of the best details from the book in this episode. But it's Otto who puts it all in perspective for his daughter. And he explains how he's relieved to see that she has this side of her where she will fight to the death to fight for what is hers and what is rightfully theirs. And he tells her, look, we play an ugly game. And he goes a few steps further where he says that winning Vhagar, who is the biggest dragon and can eat most dragons for breakfast, it's worth 1,000 times what Aemon paid. So the side of the Greens just won a very massive battle in the short term, and no one knows that more than Rhaenyra. And as the episode drew to a close, I thought we were going to see an ending that was much nastier and much darker even than the book, because more often than not, anytime a show or a movie is adapting a book that's particularly lurid, they will always tap the brakes at every available opportunity. That's just the nature of things. But for a brief shining moment, I was like, oh my God, is Rhaenyra actually going to have her husband Laenor fucking murdered in order to set him aside so that she can marry Daemon, who will be a much stronger ally in the inevitable battle to come between these various family members? And as a way of leading up to this, there was a very sweet, moving, tender scene between Rhaenyra and Laenor where he acknowledges he could have done a better job as husband, and he could have done a better job as father, and he will happily leave Carl behind and stay by her side moving forward in this inevitable battle to come. And there was a very kind moment where she basically says that like she likes him exactly how he is, even if the few times where they lay together weren't exactly the most thrilling. And so Daemon and Rhaenyra cook up this scheme that was invented exclusively for the show, because in the book, Laenor and Carl, they just get in a fight and Laenor gets killed, and they don't really go too much deeper. You just assume perhaps it was a lover's quarrel, but they don't really elaborate beyond that. But as it turns out, in the context of the show, it's all a way of giving Laenor a chance to have a new identity where he and Carl can basically be swords for hire. They can go across the narrow sea, and all that really matters is how much gold's in your pocket and how skillful your sword arm is. And so he's going to get a new life. Although it must be said that the Sea Snake and Rhaenys think that their son was murdered and then burned in the fire. I mean, that was a horrific, brutal death. And once again, when I saw that, I was like, oh my God, because I thought the book was going to be, for one time, overshadowed by just the true horrific qualities of the show. But once again, it's all part of this elaborate scheme where Damon and Rhaenyra, they're finally getting a chance to get married. They get married in front of their kids and no one else, and they almost like form like a blood pact where you would think that Rhaenyra had shed enough blood in one 24-hour period, but they're marking their faces, cutting their hands, etc. They are now a union. And when it comes to having an ally at your side who is battle-tested and ready to do whatever it takes to win a war, there's nobody better than Damon. Some might say that it's a marriage made in hell or a marriage made in fire and blood, but they are two of a kind, and they are about to go to war with the Hightowers, and they know exactly what's going to be involved. And I say they're going to war with the Hightowers because of Alicent and Otto, but obviously they're going to be going to war with some Targaryens as well, because even though right now Aegon and Aemond seem young and just like spoiled brats and spoiled, petulant children, as we saw in the teaser for the next episode, there's another time jump, and they are older, and Aemond is now wearing an eye patch, but I don't want to elaborate too much because I'll accidentally unveil something from the book. But my point is that as formidable as Rhaenyra and Daemon might be with their dragons, as well as with the naval fleet of the Velaryons, the fact that Daemon's got Vhagar, I mean, holy shit. That is an adversary. No matter how fearsome your dragon might be, going up against Vhagar, that's a challenge. But I think I've showered enough praise on House of the Dragon for one evening. I don't think I even offered one criticism of the entire episode, but I'm racking my brain. Can't really think of any criticism that I have to offer, so I just remain a very giddy, excited fan, and I love every second, and I eagerly look forward to the last 3 episodes of this season. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed this rambling, meandering, wandering recap and review of this very strong episode. If you want to talk more about the show, hunt me down on Twitter at Geeking Out. Remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell. But I hope everyone has an amazing week. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.